even now on the crowdcast, the question was in terms of how can we copy paste that solution across all Baltic countries? And are right now, as you said, you are prioritizing working in Lithuania and kind of progressing with this model. But do you believe that these kind of strategic GovTech initiatives to digitalize the government and to ensure that the policies are made more promptly, do you believe the Baltic Sea countries needs to work on the similar approach together to have the aligned solution for those innovation programs?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's a lot that we can learn from each other and then kind of export and share. And actually, we would not have been able to build the GovTech Lab if we wouldn't consult with other similar teams in other countries. And we actually, from a broader, more like global perspective, we actually have this CivTech alliance with people from Scotland, US, Barbados, Australia, where different like these GovTech and CivTech teams in the public sector, like every week, we have calls around sharing, what's new in every country. So, and there's definitely so much value in that. What we actually, one of our key focuses this year will be on kind of even kind of cleaning up the process and figuring out the most transferable parts of the process and trying to make sure that we can not only, as you mentioned, have it in Lithuania, but that we can offer to our neighbors and to other countries that we're working with to kind of try and test in their kind of markets. Of course, there might be some differences, depends on the market size and how many interest you have from the market and how innovative the public sector is, but there's definitely kind of a need for that. And just to finish up this question, we actually, for our GovTech Challenge series, the second one, we had, I think, around 60% of ideas that came were from companies and startups from abroad. So that's definitely, there is kind of that global need. And although some of the challenges, because of how public procurement works, would have to be more institution specific, but like the challenges themselves are usually global. And we, they can be, if you find a challenge in like some institution in Lithuania, probably institution Latvia or Estonia will have a similar challenge. So there's definitely a lot of like synergies and ways to work together.
So to your knowledge, are there GovTech labs like yours in other Baltic countries? And if are you planning the expansion as well in there?
So to my knowledge, there's no GovTech labs as such in Latvia or Estonia. But what we work with is in Estonia, they have this kind of team called Accelerate Estonia, where it's a bit different process, but they're trying to also get the ideas of entrepreneurs in solving governmental challenges. We are part of Agency for Science, Innovation and Technology, so we are within the public sector, which allows us more kind of sometimes credibility and trust from the public sector institutions. And so we're happy to kind of advise and help with setting up the process and everything. But I know that different countries take different approach. Like some countries focus more on encouraging innovation procurement specifically, some focus more on startups. And I think there's a kind of time for each of that step. And in Lithuania, we started more from this kind of GovTech Lab perspective and then moving on to the kind of next digitalization steps.
Absolutely. You were talking about the challenges as well that every country facing, and as well the Lithuania is facing. And yesterday during the political panel, when we were talking about the digitalization being part of the strategic 2050 agenda, the key challenges that were mentioned, that digitalization and modernization is progressing so fast, but no implementation or success of that digitalization is dependent on the legislation and on the policy change. And majority of the time, when we need a very prompt and very agile change in order to implement technology, we are facing with quite slow hierarchical government model and bureaucracy within the government and within the social institutions as well. So how can we make that process, those processes of policy change more quickly, more promptly, And at the same time, what are the next policy changes that you think are so desperately needed to allow the transformation of the digital and modern businesses that we are looking at now?
Yeah, I think, I mean, public sector, it has a bureaucracy for a reason. Of course, sometimes there's too much bureaucracy, but you have, because that the matters that are at question touch everyone usually in the country. So of course, the process has to be rigid enough so we make sure that it represents interest of all of the society, and that not just like some one person or one company can put forward their agenda and then kind of push it onto the country as a whole. So I think there's a reason why it all being so bureaucratic and rigid, just trying to make sure that it actually covers kind of all the bases. But what I think would help, figuring out what are the next challenges and how to solve them is trying to create a space, kind of a safer space, a sandbox for experimentation. So in any of the policy areas, same as in any kind of tech products or tech areas, figuring out, if can we pilot somewhere like on a smaller scale a certain solution. There's no, without trying and how it works, there's no point in trying to guess, if it's going to work or not. So I think in any of the policy areas, and I like more of a horizontal approach where we focus not on like specific policy area like energy or transport or so on, but trying to figure out what process can help all of these different policy areas. So I think carving out this space where people are giving resources, so not just leaving up to them to like figure out if they have free time or whatever to experiment, but actually having the prototyping, the experimentation as part of the policy making process, and ensure that we before we try to change the whole like laws or the whole systems, figure out before if it will work, if it not, and then that way we can avoid the some unreasonable decisions or something that will then have a more negative effect. And we will also create then that culture of accepting, and that's part of it. If we create space for experimentation, but we do not have a culture which accepts more of a failure, then that's not going to work. So we have to change the rules in a way that there are some like set budgets and time for experimentation that allow for failure, and not just experimentation that will always succeed, because then it's not experimentation, then you're just like already figured it out and you're trying to fit within the innovation framework. So I think once we have that space and that kind of resources set, then that can solve like an immense amount of challenges, both within more policy areas on like higher level, but also then on more like implementation on the tech side, because that changes the culture as well. So that can transfer them to other areas as well.
And I guess this is a very great point. You mentioned the mindset question and change of the culture question. I guess we are so used to know how to manage processes, to know how to manage operating models for the businesses or within the social sector, but how to manage culture, how to manage perception, how to manage acceptance of a new working way or the new operating model, that's the complicated bit. And I guess, the mindset that you're talking about, how do we incorporate such an agile and lean and quick and approach with an organization that is quite static, and at the same time ensure the safety and security, as you said, the bureaucracy here for the reason. So how do we ensure that security stays there, but at the same time open the doors for such a quick prompt pilot innovation approach to deliver those ideas? So can you share some examples of how your team are tackling that behavior program, or trying to support that behavior change, that cultural change, and the change in the perception of a different way, of a little bit more agile and quicker way of working and accepting technology in our everyday?
Well, I'll start with two things. So one is that as I mentioned before, in Lithuania there are 4,000 institutions that kind of comprise the public sector. So we already have 4,000 different kind of organizational cultures that might have some similarities, but they're different as well. So I guess the first step for us is acknowledging, that every institution is different, and then also that institution as such, it doesn't really exist. It's people behind it. So what we're actually doing is trying to find those people in different organizations that are keen on trying innovative solutions, because then they can be kind of our ambassadors, and then they can spread the word. Because of course, like, we're like 5 people or so in the team, so we're not going to be able to transform the whole public sector. But what we can do is give tools and the motivation and inspiration to the people in different organizations to kind of then spread that knowledge themselves. And I think then that kind of creates this network, which is way more effective than if we try like choose a few institutions and try to like reform them or so. But having this, I think most of the time that change has to come from within the institution. If someone from outside like just comes and over and says, oh, you need to be a bit more innovative, it might not work. But finding those people that are within the institution that want to bring more innovation practices, that definitely has been our kind of one of the main ways, and I think the main way of how we're trying to do that.
Absolutely wonderful. As Bartosz says, technology is for people, not the other way around. The last question that I guess I wanted to ask is about the best practices or the success examples, and why do you think the level of digitalization and innovation is so different across different Baltic countries? We are seeing examples such as e-signature are widely used and legally accepted in some countries, but not in the other Baltic countries. Examples such as e-citizenship in order to attract more skilled or technically skilled workers from outside of particular area. As well, you mentioned the school monitoring system and the education system using innovations. So why do you think there's such a difference across Baltic countries, and looks like a geopolitical and economic bloc? However, we still are quite in a different digitalization level. What do you think is a key impact to those differences?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I'm not sure if, like, for me, I usually measure it, as I mentioned, there's already 4,000 institutions in the public sector in Lithuania. So there's that many more in Latvia, Estonia, and in other countries. So I think it's difficult, at least for me, the more I get into the details and understand each institution, that depends so much. The level that we measure, like digitalization, depends so much on what criteria we take. And these, we can see different indexes and like reports where in one you're like the first one and in the other one you're somewhere in the middle. So, and that depends all on the methodology. But I think we see that in some cases where there were very concentrated and focused efforts made at the beginning of like 10 or more years ago, then that now kind of reaps the fruits of those decisions. And if there were no more concentrated efforts, then it's a bit more difficult, because of course this kind of change requires a lot of it's not something that will happen probably naturally. It's not the natural status quo. So you need someone that is kind of the change makers that can come in and just push this change. So I guess if the countries are and people there that are either start working in the public sector, are elected, if they are in the right situation at the right time, sometimes I think it's a bit more random than we would like to think, but then that can inspire like 10 other people in 10 other institutions that put forward this change. So I think it's difficult to just like separate these countries. Sometimes the institution in one country can be more similar to institution in another than within the country. So I think it's looking at the systemic level. It's like so many different variants that I wouldn't want to promote the science here and speculate.
Absolutely, and I think finally, what you mentioned is importance of the community, of the sharing knowledge, sharing experience, building that community to pilot, to test, and the importance of events like this. As I mentioned yesterday, we had all the Baltic Sea region representatives from democracy, policy makers, education, and all of them mentioned the same fact of sharing knowledge and bringing people first and changing the culture and changing the behavior and the mindset that, you know, the reality is shifting and the new way forward gonna be a little bit different. But at the same time is that that thread, that common thread, that digitalization takes over our jobs and impacts our everyday, you know, that negative viewpoint that people have a lot, that was mentioned yesterday as well. And I think important that you mentioned today is that individualized approach. Individual approach, is it one school or one institution on one particular product? It's the digitalization is all about serving people for its best practices and supporting their job. So thank you so much for joining today and talking about the GovTech Lab in Lithuania.